everyone, in our last video we drilled down and talked about levels of measurement and how the ways that we quantify or count our concepts ultimately determines the type of analyses we can conduct with our statistical package. In this video we're going to take a closer look to see how those levels of measurement are implemented in SPSS. But before we do that, we need to talk a little bit about the importance of code books. Keep in mind that computers, and also people when they're looking at data, don't not automatically know what exactly the measures mean. So we're looking at, say, a nominal variable, or perhaps even an ordinal variable. It will not necessarily be clear to the reader what those numeric values stand for. Even simple dummy variables, like gender, could be confusing for the reader without a proper code book. So for instance, if we saw a variable called gender, the reader would not automatically know what a 0 or 1 would stand for. Perhaps 0 stands for female and 1 stands for male. Or the opposite could be true. 0 could stand for female and 1 could stand for male. Every data set needs a code book which explains to the user what those numeric values stand for. The code book can be a separate file, and with large data files it's often expressed as a PDF or a Word document that simply lists out all the different variables and what their values could possibly mean. Alternatively, in many statistical programs, you can build in those definitions right into the spreadsheet. So thinking about code books, there are 4 essential elements that the user would need to know about each variable. First, the user would need to know what the variable name is. This would be the column heading you would see in the spreadsheet. Second, the user would need to know the variable label. The variable label would be a short description telling the user what that variable name refers to. So for instance, if you had a variable called US GDP 1990, the reader might presume that has something to do with GDP for the United States in 1990, but it might not necessarily be clear if that's in current dollars or past dollars or in 1990 dollars. So that information would be made clear in the variable label. The third thing, and this is particularly true for categorical variables, the user would need to know what the variable values are. This would be the range of values that the variable could take on. So if we're looking at, say, an ordinal scale, perhaps an ordinal Likert scale of presidential approval rating, it might range from 1 to 5, or it might range to 1 to 3, or 1 to 4, depending on how the data coder had collected that information. And finally, particularly true for categorical variables, is a value label. And this is critical because it tells the user what those numeric values stand for. Once again, if the numeric values are 1 through 5, the user would need to know if 1 stands for strongly agree or if 1 stands for strongly disagree. Obviously, the way you code the data would not be immediately obvious to a user who is then picking up that data set to analyze. Finally, the one point I want to make about implementing data in computer packages is computers make an important distinction between numeric data and what we call string data. Numeric data is read as a series of numeric values or integer values. String data is read as a string of characters. So numeric data could be read as 1, 2, 3, which the computer would recognize as 123. If the variable is set to string data, the computer sees it as 3 separate characters stuck together, in this case a 1, 2, and a 3. A 1, 2, 3 as a string is not equivalent to 123 as a numeric value. So oftentimes students will incorrectly, or perhaps by mistake, assign a variable as a string variable, and the computer won't read it as numeric, won't conduct any analyses, and cause students lots of frustration. So here I've loaded SPSS. When you load SPSS, your default view is going to be the Data View tab. The Data View tab looks like any other spreadsheet where you'll see all the values and variables in your data. You can see on the bottom center there's also a button to click Variable View. You can switch between Data View and Variable at your leisure. The Variable View tab tells us all about the different types of variables in the data set. Let's enter some variables to see how the Variable View tab helps inform our data view. Here, let's suppose we have SAT scores for students. I may add a series of variables like name, gender, ethnicity, and the SAT score. You can see here that when I enter in the variable names, the other fields automatically populate. The second field is type. There are a lot of options here, including numeric, whether or not we want commas, scientific notation, and currency. You'll also notice that there's a string option near the bottom. This will tell SPSS to read our values as characters rather than as numbers. You'll see here that when you select it as a string variable, you can change the number of characters. The default number of characters is 8, but you can increase this to as many as you want. You can see here for our numeric values, there are two other options for with and decimal places. Just like for the string variable, you can change the number of characters that can be displayed in each variable. Since gender and ethnicity are not going to have decimal places, I'm going to turn decimal places to 0. You'll notice that the next column that I'm clicking is the values column. Here is where you can define value labels. For gender, I only want gender to take on two values, 0 for female and 1 for male. I can add in the 0 for value and the label for female, and the value of 1 for male. For ethnicity, I'm going to use my 6 categories that we talked about in our earlier video. I'm going to list 1 for white, 2 for black or African American, 3 for Hispanic, 4 for Asian, 5 for Native American, and 6 for Alaskan or Pacific Islander. You'll see here under measure that I'm changing the measure type to reflect whether or not the variable is nominal, or the variable is ordinal, or the variable is scale, which represents continuous. In this final case, since SAT scores are continuous, I'm going to change the width to be 4, since it go from 400 to 1600, and the variable to scale. So now I've got nominal variables and a scale variable. Perhaps I also want to include the percentile the student falls within. For the ordinal variable for percentiles, perhaps I want to create 4 percentiles. I'm going to use 1 to be the top 25%, 2 to be the top 50%, 3 to be the top 75%, and 4 to be 100%. Once I have my variables defined in my Variable View tab, I can click back on my Data View tab and start entering my values. Here I'm entering in names for the name, I'm entering in my dummy variable for gender, my nominal variable for ethnicity, my scale variable for SAT scores, and my ordinal variable for SAT percent. You'll notice in your Data View tab that all of your numeric data will show as, unsurprisingly, numbers. If you want to check to make sure that your labels are right, you can go to Analyze, Reports, and Case Summaries. In this window, you'll be allowed to select your variables from the left-hand menu of existing variables to ones to display. Here, I'm just going to display gender. You can see here when I click OK, it opens a separate window called Output 1. Output 1 shows the case summaries with the correct value labels. Importantly here, I'd like to point out that when you create any output in SPSS, a separate output window is created and shows up. I'm doing this on a Mac, but if you're doing this on Windows, the output window will show as a separate tab on the taskbar. I mention this because a lot of students mistakenly select the wrong box. That is, they'll select the data view box or the program box to try to print instead of printing the output. So once again, information about the data that actually appears in the spreadsheet is really important for researchers. In SPSS, the Variable View tab, which is accessible on the bottom of the main processing window, allows you to define the variables in meaningful ways. It allows you to set the different types, the widths, the decimal places, labels, and measure type versus nominal, ordinal, or scale. This, of course, is going to be really valuable as you move forward with your own projects and your own research.